The Tule elk is one of these miracle animals that came back from the edge of extinction. It was down to, according to some people, as few as 2 animals. Other people say 20, but it was almost gone, this subspecies of elk, and now it's back. It's a miracle. The signal achievement of the Park Service in this obligation to restore ecosystems has been the triumph of the Tule elk there. This is the signal thing that they've done, and now it's in danger. For the first time in the history of Point Reyes National Seashore, they're being killed by policy.
Should they stay or should they be killed? New plans up for debate over the future of Point Reyes National Seashore, and specifically, what to do with the park's Tule elk.
They've limited to 120 adults, and so if the number goes above that, the Park Service plans to shoot those elk.
This is a bill to continue sustainable working dairies and ranches within a portion of the Point Reyes National Seashore.
Cattle are the #1 source of water pollution, ocean pollution, and biodiversity loss in our only national park.
There's no park like this anywhere in the national park system. You have wild elk, we have bobcats, I saw one 2 days ago, badgers, mountain lions, you have coyotes, all looking down from the peninsula to this amazing marine ecosystem. We have this incredible richness and in one place, and it's rare. My father was one of really the fathers of Point Reyes, so I'm sort of a brother of this National Seashore. I watched the park being formed. My father was at the signing of the legislation. He was there in the Oval Office with President Kennedy as he signed. And it says that historical, cultural virtues of this National Seashore shall be maintained to the extent that they are consistent with maximum preservation of the natural environment. You cannot have maximum preservation of the natural environment with commercial cattle there. This perpetuates a forced marriage of 2 completely different ideals of land stewardship. It's preservation versus production.
The question is, the House will suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 6687 as amended. The opinion of the chair, 2/3 being in the affirmative. Rules are suspended, the bill is passed, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Without objection, the title is amended.
H.R. 6687 essentially laid out a couple different things. It acknowledged continuation of ranches out at Point Reyes National Seashore. It also would have put into place the killing of the free-ranging Tule elk herd at Drake's Beach.
Now in Point Reyes, which is theoretically some of the most protected lands in the world, and it has a species that was brought back from extinction, and now you have the national park planning to kill the elk in order to protect the cattle industry.
This is an animal that's already outnumbered 10-to-1 by cows, which is contrary to all good park principles and law. There was a specific mandate for Point Reyes that this park would be used as a place to restore Tule elk. And that is now being ignored by the Park Service because of pressure from the ranching community who don't want to share their cattle grazing with Tule elk.
We're coming up against like twin challenges right now in the environmental realm. 2 that are front and center. You see them in the news, you see them in academic publications all the time. The climate crisis and this biodiversity crisis.
Climate change. Experts say that we have until 2030.
The biggest factor is destroying natural habitat of land for food.
Livestock causes more greenhouse gases.
If changes are not made, there will be irreversible damage to the planet.
The degradation of habitat, the fragmentation of habitat would have negative implications for the climate and for wildlife.
The elk are more natural and they fit into the natural environment. They don't have the impact on the environment like cattle, which have a much greater impact, as shows on the fence line there. On one side, there's big impacts, there's erosion and that sort of thing. On the side with the elk, it's a very healthy system with natural vegetation thriving.
We're at this point now where we need to really change our mindset, and that's not going to be easy because the cattle are everywhere. I understand and respect those businesses, but these are on public lands that are protected. It's time to make that change.
There are very few places that are ecological hotspots that have such dynamic biodiversity and microclimates, and Point Reyes is one of them.
Point Reyes National Seashore is home to 15% of California biodiversity. There are hundreds and thousands of plants and animals here, some found nowhere else in the world. And the Tule Elk, which is endemic to California, they used to number 500,000, and they were hunted down to almost extinction in the 1800s. When something goes extinct, it's forever. Okay, we thought the Tule Elk were extinct, but now we have the second shot. There was some left, and it's been one of the greatest conservation success stories in California.
It's a bad idea to expand agriculture in Point Reyes National Seashore. It's a violation to allow commercial, private gain in a national park.
We need to preserve the things that have always belonged there, and that's badgers, and that's cougars, and the Tule Elk. That's what a national park is about.
The national parks are our masterpieces, and we're striving to do everything we can to get the right resources and the right experts in the right place at the right time to make sure we can restore those masterpieces. When I'm confronted with potential for such completeness, as I see out at Point Reyes National Seashore, I don't want to tell my kid that I had the opportunity to do everything I could to protect it, and I didn't. Point Reyes National Seashore is worth protecting.
When I was writing questions, drafting questions, this is a confession. I was going to use the word eke, as in to eke out, and I had to go and check the spelling. And when I checked the spelling, I found in Google that the example given for use of the word eke is they managed to eke out a living by farming on a small piece of land. And so this idea of working the land and being a farmer and kind of working hard to just get by is very much in our culture. So with that in mind, because I know you're a nice guy, what do you have against the ranches, and what is really the problem with what's going on in Point Reyes in your view?
Well, eek, you say. I say ack. Ranches in the national park, that's ack. That's not what we're supposed to have. It's not just my opinion, it's policy and it's law. The Park Service Bible on how to manage parks is called Management Policies, and it specifies that parks are supposed to get rid of, phase out commercial ranching wherever is possible. That's the rule. It's not just policy, but it's also law. It's in the law of the establishing regulation that my dad was there and watched being signed in the Oval Office, and it requires that the natural world, the natural environment, be the priority in Point Reyes National Seashore. Let me find the language. It's because I can't remember it exactly, but it's the property acquired for the park by the Secretary of the Interior shall be administered by the Secretary, and these are quotes, without impairment of its natural values, in a manner which provides for such recreational, educational, historic, preservation, interpretation, and scientific research opportunities as are consistent with and based upon and supportive of the maximum protection, restoration, and preservation of the natural environment within the area. That's impossible with commercial ranching. There's no way that the best ranching practices in the world can be consistent with maximum protection of the environment. And that's not just for this park, for the National Seashore. It echoes the language of the Organic Act that establishes the Park Service. This applies to all parks except historic parks. The parks that are designated historic parks or historic sites, like Harper's Ferry or Harriet Tubman or Chaco Canyon Culture Center, or Rosie the Riveter over in Richmond. You can't prioritize the national environment at Rosie the Riveter because there isn't any. It's a historic park, and the movement in the history of national parks has been from an original preoccupation with recreation, steadily moving in the direction of protection and environmental protection, to the point that now 80% of our national park land is managed, if not designated wilderness, is managed as wilderness. So it's a very promising direction we're going. And the ranches fly against that direction. The other problem with ranches in the park is this continuing ranches, as proposition of Alternative B is proposing, is that this park is a house divided. There are two different ideals of land stewardship in opposition here. Production versus protection. They're not compatible. The whole history of the park has been friction between these two different ideals. What ranching there does is continued ranching is just perpetuate this forced marriage of two incompatible principles. And marriage is a great institution. Divorce is a great institution sometimes. We're ready for a divorce here. This is an experiment that hasn't worked. I guess another thing is what some of us who know Park Service personnel have seen. It's terrible for park morale. Park Service people do not go into the business to manage cattle. They're not good at it. There's no institutional memory or culture in the Park Service of managing cattlemen. They're very good at managing wildlife. They're good at managing park visitors. Very little experience in how to manage ranches. And I guess that's I guess the other thing would be the reason they shouldn't be there is the precedent. It's just not a good precedent for other parks in the system. It's a slippery slope into sort of dilution of good park principles and integrity. To have this example of commerce inside a park, the ranchers are not bad people in the park. There aren't any real villains. Well, maybe one or two villains, but they're not absentee or dilettante landlords so much. Some of them are wealthy. Some of them have put the money that they were paid for their ranches to good use buying other ranches. There are some wealthy. Many of them are just hardworking ranchers like everybody else. The trouble is they don't belong there. They're not bad people, but they found a very good thing in this park. They're subsidized. They pay token rents for the houses they live in. They live in their old family houses, but for token rents, they pay under market fees for their grazing rights. The Park Service repairs their fences when needed. Will chip in on a barn when needed. They're in on a very good thing. These are not John Steinbeck Grapes of Wrath ranchers who are starving, or Dorothea Lange, the gaunt lady who's just come from the Dust Bowl. No Tom Joads from Grapes of Wrath in there, going to the bank and begging some Kansas banker for a break on the mortgage. There is no mortgage. They pay no mortgage. Their money's in the bank, and they're really they have a very good deal. They were on their way out when this park opportunity presented. The market forces were killing dairy ranching on the peninsula. So they've got a very good thing.
If you, as you mentioned, alternative B, which some people on the phone tonight, we have a bigger crowd than usual, but a lot of people are paying close attention to that. Is there any particular points of criticism, or is there anything about it that you find, granted you just said there shouldn't be any ranching there at all. What about this particular plan? Is there something you'd like to tease out and identify?
Am I limited to just one thing? No. I guess let me just pick two things. One is the way this policy. One of the provisions of this. Well, let me just say what the alternative B allows for. This is the preferred Park Service alternative, the one that they're leaning on towards. One of the propositions is that elk be killed in favor of cows. Elk were introduced to this park according to a general mandate of Congress that national parks everywhere restore damaged ecosystems and restore endangered and threatened species. The restoration of elk, which began in 1978 in this park, is the signal achievement of this park in responding to this mandate, and it's a great achievement. This is an animal, the Tule Elk, the subspecies that was down to some say 2 animals, Adam and Eve of elk. Some say 10, 20. It's hard to get the numbers. They were on the very brink of extinction. This is one of the animals we've been able to bring back. 10 were introduced into the elk reserve in Point Reyes in 1978. They are now 500 there. They're the only national park that has this subspecies, Tule Elk. The signal achievement, and this is of the Park Service in restoring ecosystem, and it's being threatened by this provision. That elk, which are outnumbered 10 to 1 already by cows in this park, are going to be killed. A wild animal, which the Park Service's duty is to protect, is going to be killed to protect an animal that is not supposed to be there according to Park Service guidance, the guidance manual. So it's this complete turning upside down of good park principles and traditional park principles. And I guess if I said the second thing that worries me about this is what the ranchers call diversification. And the Park Service, in having this as their preferred alternative, is leaning that way. Diversification allows ranchers to grow row crops. They're now limited pretty much to dairy and beef cattle. To grow row crops, to have sheep, goats, chickens, to have B&Bs on the park land, to have creameries there, to have retail outlets for their products there and for the products of people outside the park. An expansion of the commercial aspects of this park at the very time we should be going in the other direction. And as a mind experiment for everyone here, imagine what's going to happen to predators in this park when sheep, chickens, and goats are there. You know, cattle can take care of themselves, even against cougars, against the mountain lions of the park. And they can definitely take care of themselves against badgers and weasels and coyotes, bobcats. But what happens when you have sheep there? A sheep is just asking a coyote to take it. And we know from the history of ranching everywhere in the West, we know exactly what's going to happen. Anybody familiar with the history of Western ranching knows what's going to happen to those predators. They're already shot occasionally on the range. Can't prove it. Not enough enforcement officers out there to catch it, but bobcats and coyotes show up killed. So that would be the second thing that really worries me about this alternative B.
I know there are a lot of people in this group who go into the park and love the coyotes and bobcats and wildlife there. It's a concern, special concern of many of us. Could you tell us a little bit more about, and Diane had mentioned your dad being involved in the creation of the park, and I guess related to that, as sort of a devil's advocate or with respect to the counter argument, you hear frequently that from the creation of the park, the ranches were intended to stay. Certainly you hear it a lot in op-eds, you hear it from ranchers themselves. The claim is that the ranches were built into the park from the beginning. So you remember when your dad was working on actually getting the park created. Could you tell us a little bit about your recollection and your thoughts about that aspect of the origin of the park?
Well, the first thing I remember about that is, I mean, this is before I answer your question about the fact that this contention that the ranches were integral and were always supposed to be there forever. It's just remembering how hard those guys worked to get the park. It's my dad. Here's the book. He commissioned this great environmental writer who died not too long ago, Hal Gilliam, to do this book, Island in Time, the Point Reyes Peninsula, and he got Secretary Udall to write a foreword, and he got me to review it as a 14-year-old. I was already a writer, and he passed it through his son, and he got Philip Hyde, a great nature photographer, to do the photography, and he did he helped support a film by the same name, and he lobbied on both coasts. And I think about the guys who were involved. Clem Miller, of the congressman here, who wrote the legislation, thought this was going to be his the high point of his career. It was he hadn't been in Congress long, but he knew this was going to be his great accomplishment. And they all work so hard. It's so hard to create something. It's so easy for the people we have now to take it apart. Clem Miller's replacement in this district, the district boundaries have changed, is Jared Huffman, who's in favor of this alternative B. He's the anti-Clem Miller. Clem Miller is buried in Point Reyes. Some of us know where he is, and I bet you do, Ken. And you know, Huffman should not be buried there. Not that he wants to be. If he is, I'm gonna disinter him and scatter the bones someplace else. But because it's hard for me to see all that good work in this beautiful park. I mean, there's no park like this. The juxtaposition of these two, you know, the marine system right next to this amazing land system, mountain lions, badgers, coyotes, foxes on the mountain, and down below you've got killer whales and blue whales and humpbacks and especially gray whales, and you've got elephant seals. and it's 40 miles. You know, it's an hour and a half from from where I live. It's 40 minutes from San Francisco. Nothing like this in the nation. It's an absolute treasure, and it's a terrible for me to see it taken apart. On this business of ranches were supposed to be here forever. Fake history. Total, and Huffman pushes this too. This is untrue. If anybody doubts this, it's just not just my memory, and I remember this well. I follow this as a teenager. Read Paul Sadin's history, administrative history of Point Reyes National Seashore. It was commissioned by the Park Service, and it gives the true history. It makes it clear that the ranches were never considered to be integral in this or essential to it. It was never part of the plan. It was the ranches were a stopgap measure. In order to, the government could not acquire all the land necessary. This was a way of sort of ameliorating the tax loss for the county, the lost tax base of the land, for easing the ranchers out. In 1978, when the last of the ranches were bought out, the provision was 25 years lease or life of the owner and or surviving spouse. That was the deal. It was built into that says we're phasing you out. The idea that it was ever intended to be sort of a part of the park. Jared Huffman talks about this wonderful mosaic of parkland and wilderness. That was never the idea. Nobody goes to Point Reyes to see ranches. This becomes clear, Ken, from your analysis of the commentary. This overwhelming vote to get rid of ranches. You can see ranches any place in California. You don't need to go to a national park to see it. People drive through the pastoral zone to get to the beaches. They don't go to look at cows. Find me a person who goes to look at a cow or smell, cow manure for, past Abbott's Lagoon in late summer. My God, you're lucky to come out alive. So it was never there. Read Paul Sadin's history. He points out that Connie Worth, who was the guy who originated this idea in 1935, in everything he wrote about, there was not a word about ranches being integral to it. He was talking about the natural beauty of the place, the unparalleled opportunity of this national seashore. Clem Miller never, in pushing his colleagues in Congress to pass the park, he never mentioned ranches as a virtue. In fact, the opposite. At the time, congressmen were skeptical. Republican congressmen were skeptical of the idea of ranches in a park. Everybody knew that's not the national park idea. He had to persuade his colleagues in Congress that they wouldn't be there for long. And Boyd Stewart, the great rancher who sort of persuaded many of the ranchers here that they better sell the ranches or lose the land, made this point too. They're not going to be here forever. And so it's a lie. It's a historical lie.
And that was all before our knowledge of global climate change and methane and what livestock does to the environment in general. Well, you're already touched on some of these things a little bit, but let's entertain some other defenses or counter arguments to how most of us see this issue. And you could react, Ken, briefly as you like, if it's not worth more energy, or at length if you think it deserves it. What about the idea that without the ranches and their participation in the 60s and into the 70s, we wouldn't have the park at all? What is your reaction to that?
Well, there's actually some limited truth to the fact that the ranches did provide open space. And in that sense, I guess you could say without the ranches, there would have been something else there. But this did not, in the 50s, that began to become untrue. In the 50s, post-war boom, there was all kinds of development proposed. This is prime real estate, coastal real estate. And there were all kinds of proposed projects for development of this coast, for residential development of the coast. The ranchers were losing that battle. As soon as they heard about the plan for the park, they went to the Marin County Board of Supervisors in a group and protested. The supervisors, who had always been bad on this park, immediately, they didn't even know what the plans for the park was. They immediately voted against the park. The ranchers did the same thing the east. A delegation went to Washington to testify against the ranches until they began to see the light. And you often hear on the Rancher Association website that the ranchers, in cooperation with the environmentalists, made this park. It's such BS. I mean, they fought it tooth and nail. They continue to fight it from inside the park. They continue to fight good environmental management of the national park. So so we can dispose of that one, I think.
Okay, and there are several lesser, I guess, counter arguments. This one, for the sake of time, I really want your thoughts on this one, because this one divides very liberal people who consider themselves environmentalists and very left-leaning and progressive and so on. So the counter argument is that we should have local sources of food and food security. And so instead of getting milk and beef from miles away or imported, or having rainforests cut down in Brazil in order to have beef production and so on, let's have a decentralized, stable, secure source of food. If that's given as a defense of ranches in Point Reyes, what is your response to that?
Well, I guess my response is that's all true. And this is where very good people, as you say, people like Michael Pollan, have been wrong and have corrected themselves. And people like Alice Waters, the foodie environmentalist, not quite getting, not quite really understanding in their guts the wilderness idea. Why can't we have, for example, an oyster farm, as one rancher did, in the middle of the national park? Well, that's that question from Michael Pollan. Look at this wonderful protein, the oyster, reveals that he does not understand the wilderness idea, the idea that unmanaged nature has a virtue. And I guess my question is, does it have to be in our national park, in our one national seashore on the West Coast, in the one estuarine wilderness in the West Coast, in the case of the oysters? If you want your locally sourced food, go across Tomales Bay to the other side. And you can begin to see thousands of square miles of California ranching. Do we really need the 100 square miles of Point Reyes to be sacrificed to this ideal? No, no, because the national park idea is also a good idea. It's the best idea, Stegner said, we've ever had. And yes, locally sourced food is good, but in proportion, folks. Don't take land from elk and badgers and stuff to do that. And find someplace else. There are the area now that is of public land that is given over to private ranching interests is the size of California, Oregon, and Washington combined. Is that not enough? Can we not find enough locally sourced food in an area that large for any locality you want without going into the national park? Yes, we can do better than that.
This one, I think, is personally, I don't take it too seriously. I think it's a softball for you, but you do hear it. You do hear this is a small scale operation. We're not talking about Harris Ranch. We're not talking about something Monsanto is doing in vast tracts of land. The argument is it's a drop in the bucket with respect to environmental impact. And then there are these 24 families and some local businesses and and the local community. So what do you make of just it's small potatoes, and environmentalists such as yourself should aim at sort of bigger fish, to mix metaphors?
Well, it's true that it's small potatoes in the whole greater scheme of climate change. Number one, there's what we just said, that it happens to be our one national seashore and our one, one of our few coastal wildernesses. On the second thing is, yes, small proportionally to the total global impact, tiny. But what about the precedent? What about the example of the kind of management we're now, bad land management we're now seeing? According to the Park Service's own studies, study after study, terrific water pollution in the park. Keoho Creek drainage is probably the most polluted in California, in a national park. Is that the kind of example we want our national parks to represent? Same for air. In total greenhouse gas emission, the methane that comes from either end of a cow with cheerful abandon is tiny, but it is the biggest output of, according to the Park Service, of greenhouse gases in the park. It's not our our 4.5 million people going every year, and their exhaust out of their car. It's from the belching and the farting of cows, and that's not the precedent. You don't want your superintendent, as our superintendent of Point Reyes has done for decades, to give waivers to almost all the ranches from compliance with the Clean Water Act. It's amazing to look at these documents, because it's year after year, document, decade after decade, these ranches in a national park, on national parkland, are not in compliance with the Clean Water Act in a national park. And every year, this is again a morale question, Cicely Muldoon or whoever the superintendent is has to okay these little documents that are perfunctorily filled out saying, well, the rancher is trying. He's trying to make progress. He's not in compliance, and he wasn't last decade or the decade before, but he's trying on the basis of his own self-evaluation, pretty much. So we're going to give him a pass. Is that the kind of integrity we want, or lack of integrity we're going to force on our soups, our park superintendents? So yes, small in the sense you described, but huge in this idea of the parks being an example of how to manage land.
I want to ask you a couple of things that start to point towards what we can do about it. And you mentioned Huffman. In previous weeks, in our discussions, we've mentioned Feinstein and Pelosi and a number of other players in this little drama here. What is your take on the national politics that might hold sway? Is Huffman a goner? Is Feinstein a goner? What can we expect from our national representatives with respect to the fate of the park upcoming?
This is the more I'm getting very strident. I realize my voice has been rising on the last one. This is one I'm a little calmer on because it's a little hard to see your way through. A lot of people say, I don't know what to think of this. A lot of people say, let's not antagonize Feinstein. She's so important. Let's tiptoe around her, and Huffman too, because the danger is that they'll just short circuit the process and introduce legislation that perpetuates ranching forever. That's a scary argument and a good argument. On the other hand, it's not the way I'm used to seeing environmentalists operate. My dad would never have done that. The idea that, well, let's not antagonize them. He was a much more in-your-face kind of guy. No, wait a minute. Let's not lose this by inaction. If we're gonna lose it by doing something positive, that's one thing. But just by being quiet and not calling Huffman to task or Feinstein. So I'm wondering about that, and of course it's all in the context of this insane administration that we've got now, the worst in every particular, the worst conceivable government we've ever had, especially on environment. All these things being rolled back. We've learned from Trump and what he's done how important norms are, and norms are very important in land management. There's traditions on how you treat BLM land and National Park Service land. But there's an awful lot of room for policy change and regulation change that can be done without Congress. And so this is tricky. How it's so hard to predict where this is going. I mean, if Trump is reelected, maybe we should just go to New Zealand. But it's a tricky one. I do think I am for taking a strong position. I do think some of our local outfits, Environmental Action Committee for West Marin, stellar, heroic in stopping oysters, led the fight, were the voice for Cicely Muldoon and the Park Service, who couldn't defend themselves, stopped the oyster farm. What I think is, and this is from having been at a few of their meetings, is that battle was so acrimonious and so draining to everyone participating, and people were threatened. It's difficult in these small communities to be a good environmentalist. It's hard. I just think there's a certain amount of fiber that was lost, and so the Environmental Action Committee has not taken a strong position on ranching. The Sierra Club is missing in action. So I think it behooves a lot of us to take a strong stance and not to roll over on this one.
There are a number, of course, of great David Brower quotes, and I really like politicians are like weather vanes, and it's our job to make the wind blow. So that's what I think about your answer. So you say it's hard to predict. A lot of us will predict that it'll just end up in court. And I know there's the specter of legislation from Huffman. Do you think it will end up in court? And is it appropriate for it to end up in court? And how do you think we'll do if it ends up in court?
It's interesting. The question is how far it would go in court. Ninth Circuit has been very good on things like the oyster controversy. What happens is you get up into appellate courts. I don't know. I would think this is so out of line with the enabling legislation for Point Reyes. It's so out of line with the guidance principles of the National Park Service, its own guidance principles. It is that I think in the lower courts we might win, but it's so hard to guess. And we're at the top courts. We're getting some really couple of promising decisions in the last week. Even people like Gorsuch, who come from the West and who, even though his mom was a terrible EPA director, at least he knows what a tree looks like, So who knows? I mean, and he came up with a pretty good decision on DACA. So or was it DACA? Yeah, but yeah, I don't know. It's so hard to figuring out the courts. But the other thing to remember about courts is that they are not unresponsive to public opinion. Even the Supreme Court, they're very responsive to public opinion, and it's where we need to. That's the only place rank and file like us can do. Those of us without law degrees make our voices heard.
Speaking of public opinion, and I know for some of the audience, this might seem a little far afield, but I do want to know if you think that what's going on in the news today with Black Lives Matter and with a sort of flare-up of just demand for social justice and everything else that's going on, which is quite a bit, Is it relatable in any way, in your view, with respect to the park being near, relative to most other national parks, being near urban and population centers?
I do, and our mentor for both us Kens in this has been Mark Bartolini, who was a former ED of Prensa and the Park Association, and this is a thing that he's big on. I think he's right, and everybody else is striking while this racial equity iron is hot. So why not us? And it's true. I mean, what I was saying about the proximity of this park to big urban areas we don't have enough Black folks in this park and people of color. My own experience is I'm the only person in my family that I started who's white. Both my wives have been African American women, and my children are mixed kids, and so I have a personal sort of iron in this fire, and I just remember 50 years ago, I took a lot of my first wife's nieces and nephews and stuff to Point Reyes, and I didn't realize I completely forgotten how many people I took and these are kids who sometimes from our balcony in Oakland, you look at San Francisco, they didn't know what that was. They hadn't been to San Francisco. And anyway, my sister-in-law died a couple years ago, and I went to the memorial, and all these people came up to me, big old Black dudes, some of them, they'd been in, some had gold grills they shined at me, and and they said, Ken, remember the day you took us to Point Reyes? I didn't remember at all. I didn't remember them sometimes, who they were. They were my honorary nephews, some of them, and their friends. I took a lot of their friends, and every one of them said, Ken, I remember that day. They remember every detail of that day. It's what E.O. Wilson calls biophilia. People are programmed for this. I've had people, on my board at Earth Island say, well, it's going to be hard for Black folks to adjust to, it's not urban, it's out there. Hey, we're programmed for this. They remembered every detail of this trip. And 50 years later. So it's important to get folks out there. My niece Charisse, who's now in Alabama, she told me at that same memorial, she said, Ken, what I remember is just being on the beach and sitting on a rock in the sun. These are people who don't get to do this. So I'm way for this, for hitting this, hitting on this point. Yeah. It's equity. It's racial equity.
Right. Thanks for your insights into that. I have many questions I didn't get to ask you, so I'll find you outside of our time constraint here. I apologize if it's a cliched last question. I love the quote from Ed Abbey that sentiment without action is the ruin of the soul. And I know there are a lot of people on here who are concerned, but people like myself who have day jobs and have limited time and energy for an issue that's important, but not what they get paid 40 hours a week to do, or anyways, not front and center for them. You have a lot of experience with a lot of battles over many decades. What is your advice for people who want to help, but might be a bit overwhelmed or might just be looking for some way to chip in just a little bit?
Yeah, there's there's the routine ways that everybody always talks about. Write your congressman. Op-eds, letters to the editor, those things. I don't think you need to know. This isn't a complicated issue. It's pretty basic. What are national parks for? Are they for commercial business? They're not. There's a room for. Lots of national parks have concessionaires. They run the hotels and they'll rent you a bike and all those things. They're serving the public. That's the difference between what this commerce we have in this park. this commerce is serving private interests. And in fact, the ranchers in this park are opposed to the public interest. They have a group with a lot of political clout that are working relentlessly against the public interest, the interest of the owners in the park. They, in their scoping letter, their proposal for this new management plan, they suggested limiting public access to the pastoral zone. No more public access. The thing that happens to them is the same that happens everywhere in BLM land across the West. These people who lease public lands, like Eamon Bundy and Clive Bundy, start to think it's theirs. This has absolutely happened in Point Reyes National Seashore. They lobby against public access. They put up that big sign during COVID, public stay out. That's them that put up that sign. It's not their park. It's the public's park. They routinely run people off parks. Happens all the time. Run them off the ranches. A park visitor has every right in the world to visit that park. It belongs to the people of the United States. It belongs to the people of the world. It's anybody who from anywhere in the world gets to go to that park. I'm going back to what people can do.
Please.
Don't be timid about what you can do. I mean, you said, well, people have a lot of other things. And my dad got this question always, all through his career as ED of the Sierra Club. When he spoke to audiences, they said, well, and often students would say, I'm just one person. What can I do? And he had a litany of people. He said, well, Rachel Carson, David Pessinen. When you're going out to Tomales Point points right at Bodega Head, and you can see it there on the horizon. David Pessinen, a young man who's working at the Sierra Club, stopped it on his own. Sierra Club wouldn't back him. A bunch of compromised people high up in the Sierra Club said, no, we're not going to fight people who had connections with PG&E. We're not going to fight the biggest atomic reactor in the world right there on what turned out to be an earthquake fault at Bodega Head. One man, David Pessinen, stopped it. Amory Lovins, people like Bill McKibben now. There are people like Greta. I mean, there are people who just say, no, I'm going to do it. So the hell with writing your congressman, you stop it. You stop the damn thing. That's a philosophy to remember. Anyway, I strayed. I wish I could give you my ideal place. Of course, I wouldn't tell you, I guess, if I had one. But, yeah, there's so many places. What a beautiful park. The other one is Lemon-Tour Spit. When you round the end, those beautiful cliffs that Sir Francis Drake reminded Sir Francis Drake of the cliffs of Dover, the White Cliffs of Dover. Ours are a little more golden than Dover, but they're absolutely beautiful cliffs. You come to the end and they're all the harbor seals pulled out. Sometimes an elephant seal mixed in there. Yeah. Well, what about going down to Chimney Rock and the elephant seals there, listening to them in season? Oh my God, what a park.
I realized if I ask you to say what's good about the park, I'm asking you to go over time, and I didn't really do that. Kenneth Brower, thank you very much for that.